unawailables don't get answered.
We just wanted to say your last presentation was absolutely amazing. It was fantastic. So I wanted to also say that your presentation, the reason why I liked it so much is because both of you and your amazing daughter were what I would say is in the flow. So you are presenting in the flow, doing something that is very fulfilling for you, that's you at your best, that's your natural life essence coming to the surface, and you're in the moment, and it shows.
Thank
you. So I'm very quickly going to take you through a narrative about 4 Americans who found themselves in the flow of trauma and heroism in World War II, where they became supreme warriors and where they found themselves in the flow, but in a different environment to the one that you just found yourselves in. So I became fascinated by the notion of what it took, what kind of characteristics you have to earn the Medal of Honor. Note that I don't say win the Medal of Honor. Medal of Honor recipients would never describe themselves as winners of a medal. So I started to think about this, and I thought about how can I tell a story about Medal of Honor recipients from World War II? And I did a bunch of research. I went out to Oregon and I met a guy called Bob Maxwell. I think I might have told you guys about this gentleman before. This was 2019, and he was the oldest living recipient of the Medal of Honor. He was 98 years old. There were only 5 Americans alive at the time. This is 2019, who'd received the Medal of Honor. 5 from 472. Over 50% of the 472 recipients received their medal after they died. They're posthumous. So this was an extraordinary privilege for me. Bob Maxwell left a great impression on me. It took a long time for me to persuade his friend to get Bob to pull out his medal and actually wear it for me. Very, very religious guy, and he belonged to the 3rd Infantry Division. So very quickly, hands up anybody who knows anything about the 3rd ID. Okay, one person. The 3rd ID received 40 medals of honor. So to this day, today, they officially have 40 medals of honor. 101st Airborne, can anybody guess how many the 101st Airborne have? These are the glamour boys that you all know won World War II single-handedly. Guess how many they have? They have 2. And in fact, both of those medals of honor were received a day apart in the fall of 1944 during Operation Market Garden. 117 days on the line, 2 medals of honor. 3rd ID, over 350 days in combat, and they have 40. There's a very simple reason why they have 20 times as many medals, and that's because they were in extremely fierce, brutal combat for a lot longer. In fact, longer than any other division, American division, of the 90-odd that liberated or were part of the liberation of Western Europe. 3rd ID fought from the very first day that you could fight in the European theater right until the bitter end. 5 amphibious invasions. Highest number of fatalities. All of the campaigns, 10 campaigns to liberate Western Europe. They gave the most, they fought the hardest, and therefore they received the most medals. Importantly, they lost the most lives. So if there's any one unit that we should talk about in terms of ultimate courage, ultimate determination, and ultimate sacrifice, it is the 3rd Infantry Division. That's their route there. That's an unbelievable odyssey from North Africa here in November 1942, Sicily, July 1943, 80 years ago to the day. As I talk to you now, 80 years ago, the 3rd ID were on a forced march called the Truscott Trot. These guys didn't walk, they didn't run, but it was something in between. And as I speak to you today, they were on their way to Palermo, crossing Sicily, which is right there. You guys know where Sicily is. It's an epic journey, and one that when you get to the end of it, and I've been not the North African part, but I've pretty much followed the entire route from Sicily onwards, and it's an awful long way. And you go to villages, you cross rivers, you cross streams, you go to a street corner, you go to a mountain, and you think to yourself, every single place that you are, American lives were on the line. Americans died to take each of these villages. There's a lot of streams, a lot of mountains, a lot of countries to cross before you get to the very end. This is Maurice Britt. So of the 40 guys, I was shameless. I decided I'm just going to pick the 4 that I like most, that I find most interesting, and hopefully I can have them be in combat together. So I have this ability to be able to tell the story of a small unit. To tell the story of World War II, to tell the story of the European theater, to tell the story of an entire division means that you have way too many characters. It means that your reader or your pupils can't attach emotionally to key characters. So the smaller the number, the better. So I thought, okay, I'll pick 4. 3 of them happen to be in the 15th Infantry Regiment. That's the most decorated infantry regiment in US history, 15th ID. And the greatest honor, I believe, of my life is when I became an honorary member of the 15th Infantry Regiment about 2 years ago. So to be a civilian, to be a limey civilian, and to be an honorary member, that was a huge deal. This is a guy that didn't belong to the 15th Infantry Regiment, and I'm going to speed up. This is Captain Morris Britt. So this guy is the first American, because they didn't hand out the Bronze Star in World War I, but they did in World War II. This is the first Yank, the first American to get what was called the full set. It's a Bronze Star, Silver Star, DSC, and the Medal of Honor. So by December 1944, he was a superstar in this country. He's the first guy to win every medal, earn every medal that you could earn in war. Came from Arkansas, very poor background, very humbling background. With all the characters I'm going to talk about, except for one, they were brutalized before they got into combat. They were tough. They knew tragedy. They had grieved either the loss of their mother, their father, or a close relative. They had been toughened and brutalized by life itself before they even got into what became an horrific, endlessly traumatic experience, which is combat in World War II. He actually went to the University of Arkansas and was a really good football player. And before he landed in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, he played for the Detroit Lions. So he's actually was a professional NFL player. And we will come back to him in a while. This is the 3rd ID commander, the 3rd Infantry Division commander, Lucien Truscott. He took over command of the 3rd ID for the invasion of Sicily. That's the 10th of July, 1943. The 10th of July, 1943 is when the first of you started to kill and die to liberate a place that I love, Europe. That's the 10th of July, 1943, almost 80 years ago to this day. Very sophisticated, very well educated. Look at the 3 stars on his helmet. Look at his face. This is a guy that was described by Patton as being one of the great infantry division commanders of World War II. He arrived in the European theater with a lot of booze and a copy of War and Peace. So these were gentlemen. These were gentlemen warriors that led with great panache and with a sense of history and their place in history. There's Audie Murphy, probably the most famous infantryman of World War II. Some say the most decorated soldier in US history. We can definitely say that he is the most decorated US infantryman to have served in the European theater. By the end of the war, he will, like Morris Britt, have received every medal that you can possibly gain for courage in combat, and becomes, right at the end of the war, the most decorated guy in the European theater. Rejected. We were talking yesterday or the day before when we were at the FDR Memorial about the fact that amazingly 40% odd of Americans that were inducted were not seen as physically fit. Now, in Murphy's case, he was underweight, rejected by the Marines, rejected by the Army and the Navy. Finally, was drafted in early 1943. Again, a classic case of someone that was brutalized. His father left his large family, 8 brothers and sisters, grew up in the cotton fields of Texas, started picking cotton when he was like 9, 10 years old to feed his family. His father abandoned the family. His mother died when he was 16. So this is a kid that had it really tough before he even got into uniform. Audie Murphy first saw action on the 10th of July, 1943 in B Company of the 15th Infantry Regiment. And this is a photograph of a 7th Army casualty. He belonged to the 7th Army. This is during the height of the Sicilian campaign. By the end of August 1943, we had crossed Sicily. Patton had beaten Montgomery to Messina and became the great conqueror of Sicily. And that is the successful conclusion of the first major battle to liberate Europe, July 1943. First amphibious invasion for Audie Murphy, but the second for Morris Britt and the 3rd Infantry Division. This is a character that I became very attached to. He's the only one of the 4 gentlemen I'm going to talk about that didn't have an impoverished background. And he came from a well-to-do Connecticut family. His father was a highly decorated World War I veteran, and a successful lawyer in Manhattan. He went to West Point, and in 1943, he complained about two things when it comes to West Point. He said he really hated the hazing, which suggests, why would you go to West Point if you didn't want to get hazed? It's a part of the tradition. And he didn't like the regimentation. He didn't like taking orders. So again, why would you be at West Point? In 1943, he was in the classroom at West Point, and he picked up his books, threw them in the corner, and said, I'm done. I've had enough of this. And he left West Point and then enlisted as a private in the 1st Infantry Division. And his first day of combat was Omaha Beach, 6th of June, 1944. Arrived around 1:15 in the afternoon. So this is a guy that basically said no to being an officer and went and said, you know what, there's a war on. I'm not going to sit in a classroom. I'm going to go and do my part right now, however I can. And that's actually his plebe. I'm going to go back. That's actually his plebe photograph. It's a beautiful photograph. It's like, look how high, how tall he is. He's almost 6'4". Big target. I remember talking to a Frenchman who was a commando. He actually died like last week or the week before. He was the last of the 177 Frenchmen to land in Normandy on D-Day. Imagine what a huge deal that is. You're a Frenchman, you land on D-Day to liberate your own country. There's a guy called Leon Gautier. He was about 5'6" tall. And when I interviewed him, he said, Alex, you know what? You wouldn't have lasted very long because you can't get low. You have to get low and be able to fire at the same time and run fast. Audie Murphy was absolutely fantastic at that. So at 6'4", he was a walking target. This is the 5th Army. 7th Army is Sicily. Then the 5th Army takes over the Italian campaign. So November 1942, 1st amphibious invasion. Sicily, July 1943, 2nd amphibious invasion. The third ID is Salerno, September 1943. The Italian campaign was a controversial campaign, over 100,000 American casualties, and it was basically a nightmare. From Salerno, where we almost were defeated, not enough landing craft, not enough men landed, very, very bitter fighting. We came very close to defeat. From Salerno all the way up the jagged spine of Italy, the 3rd Infantry Division fought in the fall of 1943. Truscott said by November 1943 that he was afraid that his beautiful division, these wonderful young men, had basically been wiped out. You are breaking my division. You're breaking the heart and soul of an incredible group of fighting Americans because the fighting was so tough. Mountains, mules, and men, as Ernie Powell described this campaign. You got to the top of one mountain, if you were lucky enough to still be alive. You looked out, if it wasn't rainy and cloudy, you could perhaps see the peak of another mountain, and you knew that the next day you'd have to take yet another mountain. And in what seemed like an endless range of mountains and strife. And that's a really lovely photograph of the 5th Army on the march in the fall of 1943. Britt was a company commander by the time you get to November 1943, and at Mount Rotundo, which is north of Naples, he earned the Medal of Honor. Now, when you look at his citation, it's almost as if it's comical. It's like something out of a comic book. And I became fascinated by World War II when I was 8 or 9 by reading countless comics about action heroes. So when I read his citation, I was like, oh my God, it's something like, you just can't make this up. You couldn't make this up. He was described as a one-man army. Basically, Germans attacked his company, a full company of Germans attacked his company, and he and several others repelled this attack. In doing that, he saved his own company and then a couple of others on top of a mountain called Mount Rotundo. He used every weapon that he could find, the M1, the BAR, carbine, someone estimated that he threw over 30 grenades. In any case, it was an incredible act of individual heroism. In the press, he was described as acting like a one-man army, which he really objected to, fiercely objected to that comment and said, I was not a one-man army. I was never part of a one-man army. It was people around me. You don't win a battle. You don't win anything in a war unless you're surrounded by incredible comrades. And that's a scrapbook from There's a page from his scrapbook that his grandson managed to get to me through the archives at the University of Arkansas. That's a photograph of Mount Rotundo. You'll see the nature of the landscape here. Brutal, horrible fighting. And by the end of the fall of 1943, the Third ID had been in continuous combat for almost 3 months and had set a record for the longest period that you could be in combat, that you actually were in combat in World War II. So you can imagine going for 3 months without a shower, without hot food, constantly in combat without proper sleep, often under incredible conditions, cold, windy, malnutrition, combat fatigue. 3 months is a very long time not to get a break from war. There's Maurice Britt in May 1944. He's a really beautiful smile on his face. And you'll notice that he's got his arm is missing here. November 1942, number 1, Sicily, number 2, Salerno, number 3. 4th amphibious invasion for the Third ID is Anzio, January 1944. I don't know how many people in the room know much about the Battle of Anzio, but it was a 3-month stalemate. We arrived, incredibly low casualties. In the next few days, the Germans counterattacked, trapped us on the plain of Anzio, south of Rome, and it was a slugging match, a war of attrition for about 3 months. In early February of 1944, as a company commander, his arm was blown off by a tank shell. The 12 guys in the room, he was spotting tanks, he was stood at an open window, the shell came right through the window and killed 12 guys in the room behind him. His life was saved by a technical sergeant who took off his belt, performed a tourniquet, and somehow he lived. But there were hundreds of small shrapnel wounds. When the shell went off, shrapnel went everywhere. And for the rest of his life, he might be smiling there, but for the rest of his life, he was in continuous pain. So that's him in Georgia. He's in a hospital in Atlanta. And that's a publicity photograph because he was a famous NFL player and came back and was very happy to become part of the US Army's propaganda campaign to raise war bonds, etc. This is the breakout of Anzio in May 1944. So I think some of you might remember that I mentioned there was one day when one unit lost more men than any other in World War II. It's the 23rd of May 1944 when the Allies broke out from the first day that they tried to break out from Anzio. And the Third ID had over 900 casualties in one day, which is extraordinary when you really think about it. To try and minimize the casualties, somebody came up with this idea of dragging GIs behind vehicles in these boats. So that, the idea was that they wouldn't be mown down by German machine gun fire. It was a nice idea, but it didn't work. You still had 900 men, mostly killed by machine gun fire on that one day alone. We break out of Anzio, and then we rush towards Rome, and Rome falls on the 4th of June, 1944. This is the first Axis city to fall to the Allies, the 4th of June, 1944. And on the 5th of June, the very next day, here you have Maurice Britt at the Razorback Stadium in Arkansas, and he's just down here. You can see that his sleeve is tucked into his uniform, and he's there receiving the Medal of Honor, 5th of June, 1944, literally just a few hours before D-Day, 6th of June, 1944, the so-called one and only D-Day, by which time his own division have been in 4 amphibious invasions. This is September 1944. It's a really interesting photograph. It comes after the 5th amphibious invasion for the Third ID, which was Operation Dragoon. Operation Dragoon was the most successful amphibious invasion for the Americans in World War II. You landed in the most beautiful part of France, in Provence, on the Côte d'Azur. I've actually been to the very beach where Audie Murphy came ashore and others. This is the most beautiful part of France, of anywhere in Europe that you could land and fight. And then the Allies, the French and the Americans predominantly rushed up the Rhone Valley towards Germany. And the 19th German Army, the German Army, the 19th Army, was in fast retreat, didn't put up much opposition. Here, the retreating Germans were trapped and caught and P-47s went to work and massacred hundreds of Germans as they were in their vehicles here. And as the third ID passed by, they had to push the vehicles to the side. And it was called the Avenue of Stenches because even weeks after the P-47s had gone to work, you could smell death and rotting carcasses. There's Alexander Patch and his son, also called Alexander. Patch, there's a memorial to Patch actually on the beach in Provence, near Saint-Tropez, to Alexander Patch. And he is the 7th Army commander. So 5th Army in Italy, the 7th Army is the Allied army that is coming up from the south of France towards the German border. He's 53 years old. He has around 200,000 men under his command. He doesn't sleep. He's under enormous stress. And there his son, his only son, was killed in October 1944. I used this photograph to illustrate a minor story, but an important story emotionally, which is that a lot of army commanders, or other senior officers, generals in World War II, actually had their sons fighting at the same time. So if you read the diaries and you read the correspondence of Patch, it's quite heartbreaking. It was a very moving experience for me because his son was wounded and then was pulled off the line. And the father writes back to his wife in Virginia, you know, our son's been wounded. I'm looking after him. Everything's going to be okay. And his wife begs him to not allow their son, their only child, to go back into combat. He says, enough's enough. And he, of course, the son, wants to emulate the father, wants to carry on, and goes back into combat, and then is killed. So you can imagine his anguish when he has to write back to his wife, by the way, I didn't carry out your wishes. I allowed our son to go back. That was a very, very difficult letter to have to write indeed. This is a photograph of Siegelsheim. I don't know whether you guys know where Siegelsheim is. I had no idea where it was, but that's basically Germany in the background there. And this is in the Colmar Pocket, known to GIs as the frozen crust. The Battle of the Colmar Pocket took place in December and January, December 1944, January 1945. We're right on the border in Alsace-Lorraine with Germany in the background here. This is a main entry point into the Third Reich. And the SS in particular, the Wehrmacht, want to stop us getting to the Rhine. And they basically, as Audie Murphy described it, they created what was called an iron fist. He described it like an iron fist pushed into France with the Rhine behind it. And it was an iron fist to stop the French and particularly the Americans getting to the Rhine and then into Nazi Germany. Very, very fierce fighting took place at the same time as the Battle of the Bulge. And here is Holzwehr, which is not far from Colmar, not far from the Rhine. And this, on the 26th of January 1945, Audie Murphy stood on that burning tank for around about an hour and repulsed several German attacks. He was wounded. And for this action, for saving his own company, B Company of the 15th Infantry Regiment, he later received the Medal of Honor. So this is his action for receiving the Medal of Honor here at Holzwehr on the 26th of January, 1945. It's in Alsace-Lorraine. It's near Colmar. So, you know, literally like 20 miles from the Rhine. Very close indeed. So I mentioned earlier on, I mentioned Michael Daly. You saw his picture at West Point. He comes ashore as a private in a Higgins boat on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, 1944, fights across Normandy, receives 2 Silver Stars, is wounded in September 1944 near Aachen. I think you guys may remember me mentioning Aachen before, which is the first German city that Americans tried to take in the fall of 1944 and suffered enormous casualties, disturbing casualties, casualties that actually unnerved the Allied senior command. What's going to happen later on, if this is the very first time that we fought for a German city, what's going to happen next? And what happened next was that the Germans fought incredibly hard and very effectively. But this is him in the Colmar Pocket. Wounded September 1944, he was in the 1st Infantry Division. 16th Infantry Regiment, the big red one, the first ID, wounded with the first ID near Aachen, comes off the line, actually goes and works for Alexander Patch as 7th Army commander, because Alexander Patch is a really good friend of his dad. So there was nepotism. There were, it did matter who you knew in World War II. And like Patch's son, Michael Daly says, I'm not going to spend the rest of the war as a driver of an army commander. He was a terrible driver, apparently. Patch was almost killed a couple of times because he was such a bad driver. So although Patch didn't really want to send his good friend's son back into combat, especially after he'd lost his own son, he also didn't want him as his driver anymore because he was very, very reckless driver. So he sends him back into combat. He gets his wish. Michael Daly gets his wish. By now, he's had battlefield promotion. He's a lieutenant, and he joins the 15th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd ID, to which Audie Murphy still belonged. And he joins the infantry regiment, the 15th Infantry Regiment, at the height of the fighting in the Colmar Pocket. Goes from the 1st Infantry Division to the 3rd in January of 1945. I love this photograph because it actually shows you some of the things we've been talking about. You look at this is a thin guy, a tall, thin company. By this time, he's a company commander. So he has 200 beating hearts. At full strength, a company, infantry company, is 200 guys. At no point at this stage of the war is a company fully intact. Usually it's around 50, 60% if you're lucky. But it's around, he's had at any one time, he has around about 100 Americans, young Americans, and he is only 19 years old here, under his command. And this is him after he's gone several days without any real sleep in combat, and you can see that's an image of leadership, of endurance, of perseverance, of an immense spirit. Very long, slim fingers he had. We crossed the Rhine on the 9th of Colmar Pocket, finally, after large casualties concludes. We crossed the Rhine on the 9th of March, 1945, and the Siegfried Line. And then this is early April of 1945. For the first time in the European theater, American forces start to move at real speed. Part of in Normandy, the 3rd Army, yes, for 3 or 4 weeks, but this is the first time for the 7th Army and the 3rd Infantry Division that they actually start to really roll. And thanks to one of Hitler's inventions, the Autobahn here, and they're heading there towards southeast Bavaria, towards the Alps. That's the picture of Nuremberg in April 1945. I say we, I mean the British. We had picked certain targets in Germany right from the beginning of the war to try and prove to the Nazis that we weren't just going to be bombed, but we could come back and we could hit them. Nuremberg was a target for the Royal Air Force as early as 1940. In January 1945, we basically destroyed most of the medieval center of Nuremberg. Firebombed it. We firebombed Hamburg. We firebombed Dresden. We killed at least 35,000 people, the Americans and the British at Dresden in early March of 1945. And Nuremberg basically was one vast ruin. By the time Michael Daly, as A Company commander, arrived in Nuremberg, it was held by a hardcore, a stalwart of SS soldiers. And in the Holocaust Museum yesterday afternoon, I talked about the SS, the Schutzstaffel. These are the most fanatical of Hitler's followers. And they literally fought to the last breath or the last bullet in many parts of Germany. So Michael Daly, on the 17th of April, 1945, as A Company commander, came into the heart of Nuremberg, and his Medal of Honor citation describes him taking out 4 machine gun nests, killing at least a dozen Germans, and also taking his company right to the very heart of the medieval center of Nuremberg. I want you to look at these ruins here and imagine that that is replicated throughout most of Germany. So one of the things that is an advantage for the defenders is that it's rubble and snipers can hide easily in rubble. And on the 18th of April, the day after he had performed these actions for which he would receive the Medal of Honor, he got to the very heart, very center of Nuremberg, and there was a medieval wall. It's around about 12 foot high. I was there about 6 weeks ago. He acted as the scout, as the lead, the point guy for his own company, which is unusual for a company commander. It should have been somebody else. And he gets to the edge of this wall, steps up onto some rubble, and puts his head over, just right over the edge of this 12-foot high wall. There's a crack. It's a sniper round, an SS sniper, and the bullet hits him and goes through his head, or rather his face. So the bullet entered here, exited here, broke his palate, broke his jaw, and he falls down onto some rubble and starts to bleed out. The kind of character he was, he reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out a pencil, and then rams the pencil down his throat and performs what's basically a primitive tracheotomy on himself, clearing his windpipe. A couple of minutes later, a medic comes over, they dump him on the front of a Jeep, he's taken to the nearest aid station, and they place him in a part of the aid station where the surgeons ignore these wounded because they've got more serious cases. They've got cases where they can actually save possibly their lives. A nurse walks past, Daly grabs her uniform and is able to express his desire to live, grabs her, he's operated on, and miraculously survived. Also, while we were in the Holocaust Museum yesterday, I don't know whether some of you guys stopped with me as we looked at the Nuremberg rallies display in the Holocaust Museum. That's actually taken on the main stadium at the Zeppelin field, and about 2 or 3 yards past in this direction from this gentleman here with the sunglasses is the podium where Hitler ranted and raved throughout the 1930s to 200,000 odd fanatical followers. This is the only time during World War II that 5 individuals from one unit were decorated on the actual battlefield itself. And they are gentlemen, all these 5 guys are from the 3rd Infantry Division. And you'll notice this beautiful patch here on the shoulder, the blue and the white stripes. They're otherwise known as the Marne men. And this is on the 23rd of April, 1945, the day after Nuremberg fell to American forces. One gentleman in particular I want to point out here is a guy called Keith Ware. Before the war, he was a manager of a retail store in California, a pen pusher. He was drafted into the US Army, and his first day of action was the 10th of July, 1943, as B Company commander with Audie Murphy in his company. So Audie Murphy's first combat leader was this guy here, Keith Ware. He is the only draftee in US military history who was a draftee who then became a general officer. So he rose all the way through the ranks. And here his rank is actually lieutenant colonel. And he has fought all the way from the 10th of July, 1943 in Sicily, across Sicily, Italy, through France, Colmar Pocket, across the Rhine, all the way to Nuremberg. And this is only literally a couple of weeks from the end of the war. And he's wearing the sunglasses here. And he received the Medal of Honor for actions at Siegelsheim when single-handedly he took out, again, 3 or 4 German machine gun nests and helped save not only his company, B Company, but the battalion that he led by then as a lieutenant colonel. And in my book, Against All Odds, you can read the citation in detail. It's a really, really lovely photograph. It shows you 5 extraordinary guys from this one division, 5 of the 40 men who received the Medal of Honor in that division. Where here is 26. These guys would all be in their early 20s. You know, the average age of a GI. If we go to Normandy, where there are 7,000 500 odd Americans buried there. The average age there is 22. So
I asked the audience other.
Yeah.
They all look very, very much.
yeah, well, I mean, that's a very good point. It's a very good question, because Audie Murphy was 20 years old when he earned the Medal of Honor. Michael Daly was 20 years old when he earned the Medal of Honor. And it wasn't unusual by this point in the war to have a 20-year-old leading 100, 200 guys in combat. And that's an extraordinary responsibility. An awful lot of people's lives you've got in your hands as a very young person.
The second guy from the right is Staff Sergeant Lucien Adams. It's from Port Arthur, Texas, which is where I grew up.
There you go.
And there's an elementary school named after him.
Great, really good point. Thank you. That's awesome.
I thought he looked familiar, and I was like, pardon me? Yes, the Lucien Adams, yes, the school, the high school is on Staff Sergeant Lucien Adams.
I'm going to speed up now anyway. So, you know, VE Day, 7th of May, 1945, the Germans surrender. 2:41 a.m. Eisenhower sends a telegram from Rheims. Mission of this Allied force is accomplished. 8th of May now is known as VE Day. We've celebrated it at the World War II Memorial. And the Third ID, the headquarters for the Third ID is in Salzburg, where The Sound of Music was based. And Audie Murphy was given the choice. You know, you can receive the medal at the White House from Truman, or you can receive it in the place, you know, in the European theater. And he chose to receive it surrounded by members of the Third ID. And that's him saluting Alexander Patch, the guy I showed you earlier on. And he's just 20 years old there. He's been in combat for over 200 days. Some people say he killed 200 Germans. We don't know exactly, but he has received every single medal that you can receive for valor in World War II. And that's in Salzburg on airfield on the 15th of June, 1945. Here's Michael Daly. He came back and that's him receiving his medal 23rd of August 1945 at the White House from Truman. And I love this photograph because Daly was extremely religious. He was a very devout Catholic, prayed all the time. And it's almost as if this is a sort of an act of benediction. He's got his eyes closed, he's receiving this ultimate accolade in the White House on the 23rd of August 1945. This is the largest, that should be 1945, by the way. And this is the largest number of Americans who received the Medal of Honor gathered in the White House in history. I think there are some 28 Americans there receiving the Medal of Honor from Truman over here. It's a beautiful photograph. This is Michael Daly returning back to his small hometown in Connecticut the day after he received the medal. And right at the front of the photograph here, obscured somewhat, is his father. And later on, Michael Daly said in an interview that he wished it had been his father that had received the medal and not him. He did not want to be a public hero. He did not want to come back and be treated as a superstar. He wanted to come back, be alone, hug his mother, and grieve, like a lot of these guys. The adjustment back to peacetime America was very difficult for him. The war had ended by now, and for him and many others who'd fought in the Pacific, the European theater, the contrast between the Europe or the places they'd left in the Pacific and America was very, very dislocating, very alienating. And he also, as I mentioned, he wanted to grieve. He didn't want to be paraded around constantly as this incredible hero. There's Audie Murphy, and he has like film star looks there. And as some of you obviously know, he did become a film star. This is a picture of him taken in France in 1948. That was the first time that he went back after the war. There's an interesting story about him, which is that in the July issue of Life magazine in 1945, his face was the cover of Life magazine. And in Hollywood, a guy called Jimmy Cagney, do you know, you've heard of Jimmy Cagney? He picked up Life magazine and he thought to himself, my goodness, this guy's really handsome. He should be a movie star. It was Audie Murphy, the poster boy for American heroism in World War II. And Cagney contacted him in Texas in September 1945 and said, look, come out to Hollywood. I'll try and make you into a movie star, literally. And there's a great photograph of Murphy getting off a plane in Hollywood in the fall of 1945. He's greeted by Cagney. Cagney puts him up in at his place in the Hollywood Hills, sends him to a gym. Cagney said he looked traumatized. It was really disturbing to look at this young kid, still just 21 years old. Fed him up, sent him to a gym, paid for some acting classes, and by 1947, 48, Murphy starts to receive some minor parts in Hollywood movies. And then in 1955, stars in a movie called To Hell and Back, which is based on his own best-selling book, To Hell and Back. And I think for Paramount Pictures, the film To Hell and Back in 1955 was the highest grossing movie in their history. And he went on to star in over 21 Westerns and many other films. Really talented country and Western songwriter too, and literally became a movie star. And that's him in one of his better films, Red Badge of Courage, 1951. It was directed by John Huston, one of the best Hollywood directors ever. And Huston said that when he met Murphy on the first day of filming, he was disturbed by Murphy. And he said, you know, what was it like there, etc. And Murphy was very reluctant to talk about what he'd been through. But he said that, you know, it's very hard to get excited about anything in life. It's very difficult to get really, really excited about anything because it's as if basically all of his adrenaline has been used up through all the time he spent in combat. And Huston said there was something missing there. It was as if he'd left a large part of him back in Europe on the battlefields. Murphy suffered from terrible PTSD. You know, he slept with a revolver under his pillow or by his bedside. His first wife didn't appreciate that very much. He would wake up and have nightmares and shoot the clock or a picture frame. Was not a drinker at all, but he was a very heavy gambler, gambled an awful lot. In fact, some people say that by the 1960s, he started to owe money to the mob because they were the only people that would lend him money so he could go and gamble. So the gambling was his replacement, was his substitute for the buzz that he'd got during World War II. There's Keith Ware, the guy with the sunglasses in Nuremberg. He was the only one of my 4 guys that stayed in the US Army, and he actually chose to go to Vietnam, and he became the division commander for the Big Red One. That's the patch on his shoulder there, and lost his life in 1968. 13th of September 1968. He's 53 years old, and his helicopter was shot down in Cambodia. We were not supposed to be in Cambodia in 1968, but the Viet Cong, the enemy, were. So he went, as he had in World War II, he went to where the enemy were, and his helicopter was shot down. There's Audie Murphy, died at age just 46 when a small plane crashed into a mountain not far from you guys. Actually, it's in Virginia, it's near Roanoke. Ironically, the color of the plane that he crashed in was blue and white, which is the same colors as his division, the Marne men, the 3rd ID. Here you have Maurice Britt. He actually passed away in surgery, and it was complications to a wound he'd received in World War II that actually ended up killing him. He was admitted for another ailment, another problem, but while they're in surgery, it was a complication to his World War II wound that ended up killing him. So he became a very successful businessman after the war. He never played football again, obviously, was constantly in pain from his wounds, actually ended up becoming Lieutenant Governor of Arkansas. Very fierce opponent of segregation. Left the Democrat Party because in the South, the Democrats were in support of segregation in many areas, and had a very successful business career after the war. And his grandson, I interviewed him at great length, and he said that there wasn't a day that he saw his grandfather where he wasn't smiling. He was a very positive, very upbeat, buoyant spirit. And there you have one of the last photographs I could find of Michael Daly. He, like so many GIs who came back from the war, struggled for quite some time to find a mission, a life purpose. And he said that nothing in his life had compared to the sense of satisfaction and pride he had felt as a 20-year-old leading a company, an infantry company in World War II. He said that he'd never seen so many different Americans from different backgrounds so united, with such a sense of purpose, with such a sense of mission. And for the rest of through his 20s and 30s and into his 40s, he was looking for a sense of purpose, as he called it, a cause greater than self, which would be equal or similar to the one he'd felt in World War II. Finally, he started to volunteer at a veterans hospital in Connecticut, started to raise money for that hospital, and he found that through giving to others, through service to others, as he called it, he found what he described also as a cause greater than himself, greater than his own ego. The secret to happiness, he said, to contentment rather, did not lie in several houses and lots of money and materialism. It lay in actual service to others. The satisfaction that he received, the greatest satisfaction in his life, he said, came from actually helping others, which is a moral that I like to spread when I go into high schools, etc., and say, look, what does success mean? How are you going to spend your life? Are you just going to live out the so-called superficial American dream, which is to be rich? Or are you actually going to do something for other people? By the end of your life, you might look back and think, maybe it was a wonderful thing that I was one of you, that I was a teacher rather than the banker. Maybe the accumulation of the wonders that you have performed, even though you may not know it, the lives that you've changed, even though you may not know it, maybe the accumulation of all those positive things that you've achieved at the end of your lives will mean a hell of a lot more than being Warren Buffett. I think that will definitely be the case. So I have a moral at the end of this really quickly, because I've gone over time, which is that, you know, the Medal of Honor was the ultimate accolade for an infantryman in World War II liberating Europe or in the Pacific. But I think that the greatest gift that these veterans that came home felt that they had received was the experience of fighting beside other Americans, that they felt tied to other Americans in a way that they never would again in their life. And they felt a sense of patriotism, which wasn't about so much flag waving, it was about loving their fellow Americans, understanding them, uniting, working as a group towards something that was a noble mission. And I think that it was very hard for them to find that sense of purpose again. They were traumatized. Any kind of combat will traumatize you. It depends on how you deal with it. None of these men put the war behind them. They put it beside them. And when we talk about the greatest generation, just to finish up, I think it's important to understand that not only were they great because they survived the Great Depression and they fought to liberate Europe and those who were oppressed by the Japanese in the Pacific, but they came home and then they overcame the trauma, the damage that had been done to them. And that battle, that constant challenge to overcome what has been done to you, to overcome the fact that you've become, in some ways, a monster, to heal in whatever way you can the moral injury that has been done to you by becoming a killer, by seeing people you love killed beside you. The deep moral injury that all war involves. To overcome that, to heal it in any way, is a very heroic thing, and something that I think makes the greatest generation even greater. That moral injury is profound. And I thought your presentation and yours were particularly moving because there you have examples of people overcoming moral injury. They were put in positions that they never wanted to be in. They were given guns, they were given weapons, and they used them. And yet in that process, they injured themselves on a profound level and others in a physical level, but themselves they injured spiritually and psychologically and emotionally. And for them to have the strength and the ability to be able to heal in some way what had been done is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So thank you very much for listening and